Canada. And the country sees a big future in trade with Asia.
What if I told you that Canada just delivered an economic shock so unexpected, so far outside every forecast, that it has forced the global financial community to question whether the United States is no longer the stable anchor of North American growth, but the very epicenter of its unfolding turbulence? Canada, a country that was widely expected to barely move forward, suddenly recorded a 2.6% surge in third quarter growth after suffering a 1.8% contraction in the previous quarter. This jump was not a gentle rebound. It was a complete break from the narrative that the trade war triggered by the United States and its escalating tariffs had pushed Canada toward recession. While Canada is stitching together a path to recovery, the United States is entering one of its most volatile economic and political cycles in recent memory. Immigration crackdowns, market uncertainty, collapsing confidence indicators, and unpredictable federal actions are raising a far more serious question. Is America spiraling while Canada stabilizes? This is not just a story of two economies. It is a story of two strategies, two worldviews, and two very different futures taking shape on the same continent. But the real shock is still ahead because the numbers you just heard do not reveal the deeper danger that could redefine the entire North American economy. While analysts rush to interpret the latest indicators, a far more unsettling pattern is emerging beneath the surface. The foundations of North American stability are beginning to separate, and the fracture lines point directly at the United States. Key sectors that once defined American economic dominance are weakening simultaneously. Immigration restrictions are disrupting labor supply. Manufacturing sentiment has fallen to the lowest level since the year 2019. And federal debt servicing costs have silently climbed to levels not seen in modern American history. Meanwhile, global investors are shifting their positions. Capital is slowly redirecting out of industries exposed to American policy volatility and into markets perceived as more predictable, including energy, defense, procurement, and infrastructure development north of the border. This is not simply a market adjustment. It is the early behavior of institutions preparing for structural change. And yet, these reactions are only the beginning. The deeper threat is not the slowing numbers, nor the tightening financial conditions, but something far more consequential. A policy decision inside the United States that could accelerate this divergence and trigger a continental shock with global consequences. That decision has already been set in motion, but its full impact has not been revealed to the public. The next part uncovers the move that could redraw the economic map of North America. A major transformation is unfolding inside the Canadian economy, and it is far more complex than a simple rebound in quarterly numbers. Underneath the surface, multiple sectors are reorganizing themselves in response to years of escalating trade war pressures, shifting supply chains, and unpredictable tariff cycles from the United States. Canadian policymakers have begun recognizing a fundamental truth. The era in which a single export market could secure the nation's prosperity is ending, and the next decade will be shaped by diversified economic relationships, new transportation corridors, and a rebalanced strategic outlook. One of the most significant developments is the acceleration of Canada's reorientation toward Asia-Pacific economies. For the first time in modern Canadian history, bilateral trade with Asia is growing faster than trade with the United States in key categories such as energy, advanced materials, and agricultural goods. Statistics Canada reports that trade volumes with Japan, South Korea, and several members of the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership have increased steadily, rising by a range of 4 to 7% over the past year, even during global trade stagnation. This shift reflects more than opportunistic expansion. It signals a deliberate attempt to reposition Canada as a stable supplier in a region experiencing rapid industrial growth and heightened competition for energy security. The Memorandum of Understanding between the federal government and Alberta is another indicator of this strategic pivot. By opening the door to discussions about a new transportation corridor to the Pacific coast, Canada is exploring a path that could dramatically reduce its reliance on American markets. Although no construction has been approved, the political symbolism is unmistakable. Ottawa and Alberta are now acknowledging publicly that the nation's long-term economic resilience may depend on direct access to Asian buyers, not on navigating the uncertainty created by tariffs and political instability within the United States. However, this restructuring is not without obstacles. The political opposition from British Columbia, alongside strong resistance from several First Nations communities, demonstrates that national cohesion on large-scale infrastructure remains fragile. Canada's challenge is not simply to diversify its markets, but to align its domestic interests behind a coherent strategy. Still, the emerging direction is clear. Canada is seeking autonomy in a world where trade war dynamics are becoming the new normal. Yet, even as Canada constructs a forward-looking strategy, the pressures gathering inside the United States suggest that the regional landscape is about to enter a far more unstable phase, one that could reshape the entire trajectory of North American economic power. While Canada works to build structural resilience, the United States is confronting a multi-dimensional deterioration that analysts describe as the most concerning alignment of economic and political risk in more than a decade. Labor, capital, governance, and trade policy are all showing signs of simultaneous strain, creating a systemic fragility that threatens to deepen as new directives and political tensions intensify. One of the most immediate concerns lies within the American labor market. More than 17% of the nation's workforce consists of foreign-born workers, with much higher concentrations in agriculture, construction, healthcare, logistics, and manufacturing. Federal moves to freeze immigration channels, reopen more than 200,000 asylum cases, and restrict entry from multiple regions are destabilizing essential industries. Agricultural associations warn that seasonal labor deficits could exceed 150,000 workers. Hospitals in aging states report staffing shortages that could undermine care capacity. Manufacturing sentiment has fallen to its lowest point since the year 2019, reflecting uncertainty rather than a normal cyclical decline. At the same time, the fiscal outlook of the United States is deteriorating. Interest payments on federal debt now rival major departmental budgets, signaling long-term structural imbalance. Treasury market volatility has increased as institutional investors begin diversifying exposure away from American policy unpredictability. This shift does not reflect a loss of faith in the size or innovation of the American economy, but rather concern about its governance, consistency, and political trajectory. Compounding these pressures is the increasingly erratic nature of federal policymaking. The repurposing of agencies such as the Treasury Department and the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network for immigration enforcement duties reflects a broader institutional shift that markets interpret as instability. For nations and corporations conducting billion-dollar trade decisions, the reliability of American governance is not a philosophical matter, it is a financial risk factor. These developments directly affect the North American trade ecosystem. As tariff threats reemerge and supply chain coordination becomes more fragile, the integrated economic relationship between Canada and the United States faces unprecedented vulnerability. Every new policy announcement from Washington carries the potential to disrupt cross-border investment, logistics, and manufacturing operations. But the most alarming indicator is not the weakening numbers, the strained institutions, or the policy volatility. It is a new, undisclosed development circulating among international observers, one that could accelerate this divergence and permanently alter the balance of economic influence in North America. The nature of that development will redefine everything that comes next. Across Europe and Asia, governments and global financial institutions are reassessing their expectations about the long-term reliability of the United States. For decades, American economic leadership functioned as a stabilizing force during periods of global turbulence. Yet today, the combination of political polarization, rapid policy reversals, escalating tariff measures, and unconventional institutional directives is prompting widespread concern. Senior officials within the European Union have begun warning that transatlantic trade frameworks may face unprecedented strain if tariff tensions intensify. Negotiations that once operated under assumptions of predictability now unfold in an environment where a single executive directive can reverse years of progress. In the Asia-Pacific region, Major economies such as Japan and South Korea have already increased their contractual commitments with Canada in energy, agriculture, and critical mineral supply. These strategic shifts are not symbolic gestures. They reflect a pragmatic acknowledgement that American trade policy has become too volatile to serve as a singular foundation for long-term planning. International investors share this view. Several global asset managers are reallocating capital toward markets where regulatory continuity and institutional stability are perceived as more dependable. Canada, with its moderate fiscal posture and diversified trade ambitions, is emerging as one of those preferred destinations. This recalibration of global expectations is creating a new reality. For the first time in generations, the world is preparing for a North America where the United States may no longer be the uncontested center of stability. As the international community shifts its strategic orientation, Canada is moving decisively to solidify its emerging role as a dependable, rules-based economic partner. The growing alignment between federal and provincial governments on long-term trade diversification, illustrated by renewed cooperation between Ottawa and Alberta, signals a broader national acknowledgement that the future of Canadian resilience may depend on reducing exposure to American policy volatility. Major sectors such as energy, agriculture, and advanced manufacturing are now embedding diversification into their planning models. The prospect of a Pacific export corridor, although still in early deliberation, is deeply significant to Asian buyers seeking predictable suppliers amid global uncertainty. Foreign direct investment patterns reinforce this momentum. International firms increasingly view Canada as a strategic foothold into both the transatlantic and Asia-Pacific markets, while also benefiting from a regulatory environment that avoids the abrupt shifts currently seen in the United States. Even with internal debates and regional opposition, Canada's trajectory exhibits coherence. Strengthen external linkages, expand market diversity, and insulate national industries from external political turbulence. However, the global recalibration toward Canada is not occurring in a vacuum. Multiple governments have quietly circulated assessments indicating that the next phase of the regional trade war may escalate more sharply than expected, involving actions that reach beyond tariffs, beyond regulatory tightening, and into areas that could reshape the strategic balance of the entire continent. And those assessments point to a development so consequential that, once triggered, it could alter the long-term distribution of economic power between Canada and the United States. That development is the focus of the next part, and its implications are far more severe than current public discussions suggest. Within the North American economic system, a series of structural signals are beginning to converge, suggesting that the region may be entering a period of long-term realignment. These signals are subtle enough to escape headline coverage, yet substantial enough that trade analysts and international institutions are now treating them as early warnings of a deeper systemic change. At the center of this shift is the evolving relationship between Canada and the United States, shaped by diverging policy priorities, distinct institutional behaviors, and a widening gap in global investor sentiment. One of the most important developments lies in the integration of supply chains. For decades, the automotive, aerospace, agricultural, and energy sectors of North America operated under the assumption that stability in the United States was a given. That assumption is now being revised. Corporations across these sectors are quietly reassessing their exposure to American regulatory unpredictability and tariff risks. Several multinational firms have begun transferring components of their production networks to Canada or Mexico, not as temporary adjustments, but as long-term risk management strategies. This trend highlights an emerging reality. The traditional gravitational pull of the United States as the regional economic anchor is weakening. Furthermore, newly released trade data from international monitoring bodies indicates that imports into the United States from key partners are experiencing irregular fluctuations inconsistent with normal market cycles. These disruptions suggest deeper instability within domestic logistics, consumer demand, and workforce availability. The international view is increasingly that the United States is no longer operating within predictable parameters. Instead, its trade patterns reflect internal governance volatility and inconsistent policy frameworks. Canada, positioned directly adjacent to this turbulence, faces both opportunity and exposure. As global suppliers seek a stable North American foothold, Canada is becoming a preferred platform for long-term contracts, energy partnerships, and resource development projects. Yet this shift also places Canada in a delicate position. It must absorb growing global demand while insulating itself from the ripple effects of American instability. Analysts warn that the next stage of this trend may involve a more visible decoupling, as companies and nations redirect investment and supply chains toward markets less affected by tariff uncertainty and executive-level policy reversals. Should such a decoupling accelerate, the economic balance of the continent would undergo a transformation unseen in modern North American history. Yet, according to internal assessments circulating among global financial institutions, an even more consequential shift is forming, one that could fundamentally redefine the strategic status of both nations. The geopolitical landscape of North America is beginning to reflect forces that extend far beyond conventional economic cycles. As the United States experiences rising institutional tension and escalating political polarization, Canada's relative stability is becoming a strategic asset with implications well beyond commerce. Governments in Asia and Europe are expanding diplomatic engagement with Ottawa, not only to secure long-term energy and trade relationships, but also to establish political continuity with a nation perceived as more aligned with multilateral norms. This perception is driving a subtle but meaningful shift in how global actors view North American power distribution. Where the United States once commanded default diplomatic centrality, the new environment is allowing Canada to assume a more influential mediating role. This shift is visible in high-level economic dialogues, collaborative resource frameworks, and cross-regional trade planning. It reflects a growing recognition that Canada's predictable governance, diversified trade architecture, and environmental resource base position it as an increasingly essential partner in an unstable global economy. At the same time, several leaked analyses from international policy think tanks warn that the economic instability inside the United States could soon escalate into strategic instability. Rising fiscal pressures, workforce fragmentation, and unpredictable policy movements are creating vulnerabilities that foreign governments are monitoring closely. If these vulnerabilities deepen, North America may face a scenario where Canada becomes the stabilizing counterweight to an increasingly volatile southern neighbor, a reversal of roles that would mark one of the most significant geopolitical shifts in the region's modern history. This possibility is already influencing long-term planning for multinational corporations, global lenders, and defense partners. Should the United States continue on its current trajectory, Canada could emerge as the more reliable gateway for investment, supply chain continuity, and strategic alliances. The stakes, therefore, extend beyond economics. They encompass the balance of regional influence, the viability of shared security frameworks, and the future architecture of North American governance. But the most critical insight does not lie in what has been publicly discussed. It lies in the classified forecasts now circulating among senior policymakers, forecasts indicating that a triggering event may soon force a definitive realignment of power within North America. What that event entails will alter everything that follows. Canada is entering a phase of long-term strategic planning that extends well beyond the quarterly fluctuations dominating financial headlines. The overarching objective is clear: reduce structural dependence on the United States, strengthen economic sovereignty, and position Canada as a central player in a world defined by shifting alliances, trade war volatility, and unpredictable tariff cycles. Central to this effort is the development of a multi-corridor trade system designed to integrate Canada more deeply with the Asia-Pacific region and, to a lesser extent, with the European Union. The early-stage discussions surrounding a potential Pacific energy and export route underscore a broader strategy to unlock new markets and reduce vulnerability to American political instability. Even without construction approval, the very existence of such discussions signals to global investors and partner nations that Canada is reorganizing its long-term economic architecture. Additionally, Canada's emphasis on regulatory continuity, climate-aligned industrial policy, and strong institutional governance provides a competitive advantage as global capital searches for safe jurisdictions. Foreign direct investment patterns already reflect this preference. The critical minerals sector, in particular, has attracted renewed interest as manufacturers seek stable supply chains insulated from geopolitical tension. These shifts indicate that Canada is quietly building the pillars of a more autonomous economic model. However, the effectiveness of this strategy depends on Canada's ability to navigate internal resistance, regional disparities, and Indigenous governance frameworks. The potential for national fragmentation remains real if policy alignment is not achieved. Yet the global context is pushing Canada toward a role that it has not occupied in generations, the role of a stabilizing economic power within an increasingly turbulent North America. And as Canada builds its foundation, an even more consequential development is unfolding inside the United States, one that could accelerate Canada's rise faster than any domestic policy ever could. According to a series of classified economic stress models quietly circulated among international institutions, the United States is approaching a threshold at which internal instability may begin to affect not only its economic performance, but its strategic coherence as a global power. These models synthesize data from workforce dynamics, fiscal risk projections, institutional stress tests, and emerging geopolitical pressures. The results show an alarming possibility. If current trends persist, the United States may face a structural inflection point that alters its position within the global hierarchy. One of the most concerning findings relates to the concentration of vulnerabilities across multiple systems at once. Labor shortages, rising federal debt obligations, volatile tariff policy, and political polarization are not isolated issues. Together, they represent a complex system moving toward reduced resilience. For decades, American power rested on a foundation of economic reliability, institutional stability, and global confidence. That foundation is beginning to erode in ways that foreign governments and multinational corporations are now openly preparing for. These global preparations include the diversification of supply chains away from the United States, the reassessment of long-term investment strategies, and the strengthening of alliances with nations perceived as more stable. Canada stands to benefit significantly from this shift, but only if it can maintain internal cohesion and advance its diversification strategy with precision. The twist, however, lies in the final component of the international stress models. They indicate that a single triggering event, a policy shock, a financial disruption, or a geopolitical escalation could accelerate this continental realignment far more rapidly than anticipated. In such a scenario, the balance of economic power within North America could shift in a matter of years, not decades. And the nature of that potential triggering event is the missing piece that transforms this analysis from a warning into a turning point. The next part reveals why that event may be much closer than policymakers admit. North America is entering a moment of profound transformation, one shaped not by a single economic report or isolated political decision, but by a deeper continental shift that has been building quietly for years. Canada is positioning itself with long-term strategy, structural diversification, and institutional stability. The United States, meanwhile, faces a convergence of internal pressures that is reshaping how global partners, investors, and even neighboring governments evaluate its reliability as an anchor of regional stability. These trajectories are not predetermined, and they are not irreversible. But the divide between a nation preparing for the next decade and a nation struggling with the tensions of the present is becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The choices made now on trade policy, institutional governance, workforce strategy, and federal coherence will determine whether this divergence becomes a temporary imbalance or a permanent redefinition of North American power. The central question for viewers is this: is the current path a bold strategic recalibration for the United States or a risky mistake that could accelerate its loss of regional influence? Your perspective matters, and your voice shapes the conversation.